Good evening to all the beautiful people tuning in. I'm here to help you sleep. Please support me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're watching from and at what time, so drop a comment below. Are you ready? Let's start with the first story.
The title of the story, The Quiet Road Up North. The wind was unforgiving, tearing at the group of young friends as they huddled close in the idling car. Outside, the barren Canadian landscape stretched endlessly. Nothing but snow and the thick woods surrounding the lonely road. The tires of their old rusting car had kicked up a cloud of powdery snow when they'd arrived. But now, with the engine sputtering to a halt, the air was suffocatingly quiet, save for the howl of the wind that seemed to echo through the trees. "I think it's the battery," Tim said, looking at the flickering dashboard. The harsh white light from the headlights barely cut through the thick darkness beyond. "Great," Emily muttered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "No cell service, no one for miles. This night just keeps getting better." They'd been on their way back from a party in a nearby village, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the air always smelled faintly of wood smoke. It was a 3-hour drive back home, and the snowstorm had made it even worse. Now, stranded in the middle of nowhere, the only thing left to do was wait. "Let's just stay in the car," James said, the ever-optimistic one. "Someone will drive by eventually. We'll be fine." But the minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. It was freezing, and the engine's heat had long since faded. As the wind whistled through the trees outside, the group's conversation began to die down. They sat in silence, the only sounds the occasional creaks of the car's frame as it adjusted to the weight of the snow accumulating around it. Then something unusual caught their attention. A faint sound like footsteps. At first, they thought it was the wind playing tricks. But then the sound came again, louder this time, closer. "What was that?" Emily asked, her voice low. "Probably an animal," Tim replied, his eyes darting nervously to the rear-view mirror. "Maybe a deer or something. Just stay calm." But the footsteps continued, slow, steady. They were far too deliberate to be the random shuffle of some woodland creature. The others remained silent, exchanging uneasy glances. A branch snapped in the distance, and a cold shiver ran down their spines. "Okay, that's not normal," James said, his voice trembling. That sounded like someone walking toward us." "Stop it," Tim snapped, trying to sound brave. "It's just the storm. You're freaking everyone out." But Emily, her breath catching in her throat, pressed her face against the cold window, squinting into the darkness. "I swear I saw something moving out there." She pointed into the forest. They all turned to look. At first, they saw nothing but the indistinct silhouettes of the trees swaying under the harsh winds. Then something shifted, something darker than the night itself, just beyond the pale glow of the headlights. A figure. It was a woman, at least it appeared to be. She was tall and gaunt, her skin unnaturally pale under the dim light. She stood motionless, framed by the trees, her eyes hollow and unblinking. The wind whipped around her, but her hair stayed eerily still, hanging in damp, greasy strands.
Is she looking at us?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. The others strained to see her, but the moment they focused, the figure vanished, gone, as if swallowed up by the darkness. "What the hell?" Tim whispered, a chill running up his spine. James was the first to react. "We need to get out of here. Now." They threw open the car doors, their breath visible in the frigid air as they hurried to gather their things. The wind slammed into them like a physical force as they made their way away from the car, their feet crunching through the snow. And then it came again, the sound of footsteps. But this time they weren't coming from the woods. They were coming from the direction of the forest. Close. Too close. "I saw her," Emily said, her voice shaking. "She was standing there. Just standing there." "What the hell are you talking about?" Tim asked, trying to steady his own nerves. And then they saw her again, the woman. She had materialized from the forest, as if she had always been there, standing at the edge of the tree line. Her form was blurry at first, but as she stepped closer, they could make out more of her features. The gaunt face, the hollow eyes, and the unnerving silence that seemed to surround her. Emily's heart raced. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice cracking. The woman didn't answer. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She just pointed toward the deeper darkness of the forest, her long, bony finger unnaturally still. The wind howled around them, but the figure remained unmoving. "Come on," Tim urged, grabbing Emily by the arm. "We need to go, now." But Emily didn't move. She was transfixed, her eyes locked on the figure, unable to break free from its unsettling gaze. "No, there's something wrong. Something is wrong about this." "Emily!" Tim shouted, shaking her. But before she could respond, one of the guys, Dan, took a step forward, his curiosity pushing him toward the woman. "I'm going to see what she wants," he muttered, his voice tight with unease. "Stay here." "Don't!" James yelled, but it was too late. Dan was already walking toward the forest, his footsteps crunching in the deep snow. The rest of them watched as he disappeared between the trees, the light of the car's headlights fading behind him. The air felt suddenly colder, the night darker. And then they heard it. At first it was soft, a child's laughter, distant but unmistakable. But it grew louder, closer,
An eerie chorus of laughter, high-pitched and mocking, echoing through the trees. "What the hell is that?" Tim asked, his voice trembling. Is that coming from him?" The sound was relentless, building in volume, the sound of children laughing. And then the trees parted, and Dan appeared again. Only it wasn't Dan. The figure that walked toward them was distorted, a twisted version of their friend. His eyes were wide, bulging out of his face, and his mouth hung open in a ghastly grin. "Dan?" Emily whispered, backing away. But the figure was silent. It reached out a hand toward her, as if beckoning her to follow. Behind it, the forest seemed to pulse, its shadows growing ever darker, the laughter becoming louder, more frantic. And then the realization hit them like a hammer. They weren't alone. The forest had claimed them. The woman had never been there to warn them. She was there to lead them into the woods, where the others who had vanished years ago were now trapped, lost to the cursed road. The wind howled again, and the whispers from the darkened woods began to grow louder. The spirits of the lost, of those who had vanished without a trace, were calling. And now they, too, were part of the road's tragic history. As the shadows closed in, the friends understood. The road was a curse, and the forest, hungry for souls, would never let them leave.
The Highway Spectre. Adam had been driving for hours, the headlights of his car illuminating only a sliver of the road ahead. The rest of the world remained swallowed by the creeping darkness that stretched endlessly around him. His eyes felt heavy, the remnants of a long business meeting clouding his mind. He took a deep breath, flicking the air conditioning on higher to fight the sleepiness creeping up on him. The Midwest was a quiet place, especially in the dead of night. The highways here seemed to go on forever, with no sign of life but the occasional truck or blinking sign on the horizon. But then, as the road curved around a bend, something caught his eye. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, Adam thought it was an illusion, a mirage created by the fatigue of too many miles. But the figure didn't disappear. It lingered, unnervingly still in the dim light. A woman, dressed in a white gown, her hair blowing slightly in the breeze, though there was no breeze to speak of. Adam slowed his car, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. Who would be out here at this hour? He pulled over, the tires skidding against the gravel shoulder. The woman didn't flinch. She only turned her head toward the car, her hollow eyes meeting his. A chill ran down his spine, but he rolled down the window anyway. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice strained. The woman didn't speak at first, only staring at him. Then she finally answered, her voice soft but urgent. "I need a ride. Please, can you take me home?" Adam hesitated. There was something off about her. Her white dress, the pale pallor of her skin, the stillness of her body, as if she were a part of the night itself. But she seemed so fragile, so lost. Against his better judgment, he nodded.
"Where to?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She pointed vaguely down the road, her arm trembling slightly. "Just keep driving straight. I'll tell you when we're close." He nodded again, and she opened the door. The moment she stepped inside, the temperature in the car seemed to drop. Adam shivered, though he couldn't explain why. He told himself it was just the air conditioning, but the chill felt unnatural, like something was seeping into his bones. As they drove, the woman said little, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Adam tried to shake off the growing feeling of unease, but it gnawed at him. The road stretched on and on, a dark ribbon of asphalt swallowed by the night. He glanced at her occasionally, wondering who she was, why she was out here, but she never spoke unless prompted. Her responses were short, and her directions were always vague. "Just keep going straight," she repeated several times. "It's just up ahead." The car's headlights illuminated nothing but the dark, endless stretch of road. It seemed as if the world itself had stopped existing outside of this quiet, strange journey. A crackling noise from the radio startled him. It wasn't just static, it was voices, distorted and incommunicable, as if someone were trying to speak, but their words were being consumed by something else. Adam reached to turn off the radio, but the dial was unresponsive. He glanced at the woman. "Do you hear that?" he asked. She didn't respond. Instead, she stared at him, her eyes wide, though her face remained emotionless. It unnerved him more than he cared to admit.
Finally, after what seemed like hours, she told him to stop. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper now. "My home." Adam pulled over to the side of the road. They had reached an old, dilapidated house. It loomed in the darkness, half hidden by the overgrown brush that had taken over the yard. The windows were dark, the porch sagging, as though the house hadn't been lived in for years. This is where you live?" Adam asked, confused. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the house. Adam felt a tightening in his chest as the quiet of the night grew oppressive. Something wasn't right. "I'll read here," she said. Adam stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching on the gravel. He turned toward the house, and for the first time he noticed the faintest smell of decay in the air, like the house had been abandoned for a long time. He walked toward the porch, his footsteps slow, cautious. The door to the house was ajar, but he didn't dare go inside. He called out to her. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice tight. The woman didn't respond. Instead, he heard the faintest sound behind him, like the creaking of floorboards, followed by the whisper of a door closing softly. Adam turned back around, only to find the woman was no longer in the car.
He rushed back to the vehicle, his heart racing. She was gone, and the car door was open. Confused, he stared at the house, something in his gut twisting. There was no sign of her. Then he saw it, a faded newspaper clipping stuck to the windshield wiper. He peeled it off with trembling hands. The headline read, "Local woman dies in highway crash. Body found near abandoned house." Adam's breath caught in his throat. The woman had died in the very spot where he had stopped to help her. But the chilling realization hit him as he looked up at the house. Something else was watching him in the shadows. The house wasn't empty, and neither was the road. In the distance, he could hear the faintest whisper. It wasn't the woman's voice. It was something darker, something older, something that had always been here.
The title of the story: The Last Train. It was a cold evening in late October, the kind of night when the air felt heavy with the weight of something unspoken. The streets of New York were bustling with the usual late-night crowd, people hurrying home from their jobs, chasing last-minute errands, or simply seeking solace in the anonymity of the city. But for Thomas, the office worker whose day had stretched far too long, all he wanted was to collapse into his bed and escape the grind of the city. His shift had ended hours ago, and now he stood exhausted at the entrance to the city's aging subway system, looking at the flickering overhead lights that seemed to flicker in time with his exhaustion. He stepped down the stairs into the dimly lit station, where the air smelled faintly of mildew and rust. The subway lines had existed for nearly half a century, and despite being an essential part of the city's infrastructure, the underground was something of a forgotten relic, especially at night. The station was eerily quiet, the only sound the rhythmic tapping of Thomas's shoes against the cold, cracked tiles. The train he needed to catch would be the last one of the night, a single, long ride that would take him out of the city and drop him near his apartment in a quieter part of town. He sighed as he made his way down the platform, his breath visible in the frigid air that clung to the station like a shroud. The train was late. The platform was virtually empty. Only a few stragglers stood in the shadows, keeping to themselves. Thomas glanced at his watch and frowned. It had been a long day. He just wanted to get home.
Finally, the low, rumbling sound of the train's approach reached his ears. As it rolled into the station, its worn metal body scraped against the rails, producing an unsettling squeal. The train was old, practically ancient. The doors creaked open with a groan, and Thomas stepped inside, his footsteps echoing as he entered the car. The interior was exactly as he expected, dimly lit, its windows covered in grime, and the air thick with the smell of old leather and stale air. There were only a few people on the train, their faces hidden in the shadows. The car felt like a forgotten place, isolated, almost like something between worlds. The flickering lights above did little to dispel the sense of unease that began to crawl under Thomas's skin. He found a seat in the far corner of the car and settled in. As the train began to move, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks soon became a lullaby of sorts.
soothing his wearied mind. His eyes began to droop, his body yearning for sleep. But then something caught his attention. A figure sitting alone in the farthest corner of the car caught his gaze. The woman sat slouched slightly, her face obscured by dark, untamed hair. She was dressed in a long, dark coat, her hands folded in her lap. And though the train rattled and lurched along the tracks, she remained perfectly still. Thomas's curiosity piqued. It wasn't unusual to see odd people at this hour, but something about her seemed out of place. Her stillness was unnatural. Other passengers would shift in their seats or glance around, but not this woman. Her presence felt unsettling. He studied her for a moment longer, his tired eyes narrowing as he wondered why she hadn't gotten off at any of the stations they had passed. The train was now deep into the outskirts of the city.
His heart rate quickened slightly as he stood and began walking toward her. The sudden movement caused the train to lurch forward sharply, and Thomas stumbled, his hand grabbing the metal pole near his seat to steady himself. When he regained his balance and looked back up, he noticed something strange. The woman hadn't moved an inch. She was still in the same position, her head lowered, her hair cascading over her face. A soft sound broke the silence. Quiet. Sobs. At first, Thomas thought he might have imagined it, but as he took another step closer, he heard it again, a barely audible weeping coming from the woman. The sound was gentle, almost ethereal, and it stirred something in his chest, urging him to investigate further. He stood next to her now, his shadow falling across her slumped form. For a moment, Thomas stood frozen, caught in the quiet sorrow that seemed to seep from her every movement. Her sobs became more pronounced, more real, though she did not seem to acknowledge his presence. He cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of himself. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't respond at first. Then slowly she lifted her head. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, and her eyes were hollow, the skin around them stretched and bruised. The tears that streaked down her face seemed to glisten in the dim light, but her expression was distant, vacant. Thomas stepped back involuntarily, his stomach flipping with a mix of unease and horror. The woman's lips parted, and in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she spoke. "I died here years ago." The words hung in the air, thick and cold. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He took another step back, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. His body was frozen with fear, his senses on high alert. The woman's eyes stared at him, empty and lifeless, yet they seemed to pierce right through him.
Before he could react, the train suddenly lurched again, the lights flickering and dimming as it jerked forward. A cold wind gusted through the car, sending a shiver down Thomas's spine. When the lights flickered back on, the woman was gone. In her place was only a faint trace of coldness, an icy chill that hung in the air like a ghostly residue. Thomas stood, utterly still, his breath shallow as he scanned the now empty car. His chest tightened. The other passengers, the few who had been there, were gone as well. The doors of the train slid open with a soft hiss, and Thomas, his heart pounding in his chest, walked shakily to the door. When he stepped off the train, he found himself not at the station he was supposed to be at, but in a completely different place, an unfamiliar, deserted platform. The lights above flickered weakly, casting long, strange shadows across the tracks. A figure stood in the distance, partially obscured by the dark, but Thomas could make out the shape of a man watching him from the shadows. His gaze seemed to burn with an intensity that sent another chill down Thomas's spine. The train doors closed behind him with a dull thud, and the train rattled off into the night, leaving him alone on the platform. For a moment, Thomas stood frozen, his mind spinning, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The woman, had she been a ghost, a trick of the mind, or something darker, something far more sinister? He didn't know. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught the figure in the shadows again, but this time it wasn't a man. It was something else entirely. A face, pale and twisted, stared back at him. It was the woman from the train, only this time she wasn't crying. She was smiling.
The title of the story, The Light from the Old House. The party had stretched into the early hours of the morning, but for Amber, Joe, Sarah, and Tom, the night was far from over. They had wandered away from the main group after the music had died down, laughing at nothing in particular, their voices blending with the distant crooning of crickets. The humid southern air hung thick around them, but the warmth of the alcohol in their veins kept the chill from fully settling in. They were on their way back to their car, but the woods seemed endless, the winding paths turning every which way, until they were disoriented, lost. "Should have brought a flashlight," Joe muttered, pulling his phone out. The screen glowed faintly in the darkness, but it was no match for the overwhelming blackness of the forest. Sarah squinted at the thick trees ahead. "Is it just me, or does this place feel off?" Amber looked around, uncomfortable with the unease creeping up her spine. The shadows felt heavy, the wind whispering through the branches in a way that was almost too deliberate. A distant sound made them all stop, creaking like an old door, but nothing around them seemed to move. The woods had an eerie stillness now, a sort of pregnant pause before something happened. "Maybe we should head back toward the clearing," Tom suggested, his voice a little too tight. But as they turned to retrace their steps, a strange light caught their attention.
It flickered, faint but unmistakable, an orange glow in the distance, almost like a candle burning from a window of a house. But that didn't make sense. There were no houses out here, not for miles. "What is that?" Joe asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. His voice sounded almost hopeful. Amber squinted. The light didn't belong there. Too steady, too warm. That's a house. Isn't that the one everyone says is haunted? Tom said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Sarah's eyes widened. The old Walker house? It's been abandoned for years. The light flickered again, like a beacon in the darkness. It wasn't just a candle. It was brighter now, almost too bright. Something about it felt wrong, but the pull of curiosity was too strong to ignore. Without another word, they moved forward toward the light. The closer they got, the more the house seemed to materialize out of the darkness, standing as if it had always been there. The foundation was cracked, the wooden beams warped, but still there was that strange light shining from within. Overgrown vines twisted their way through the broken windows, but the light inside didn't flicker or dim. It was steady. Amber felt a shiver creep down her spine. This place is wrong. But they kept walking, drawn by the strange allure of the house. As they stepped closer, the front door stood ajar, creaking on its hinges, as if inviting them in.
"Should we really go inside?" Joe asked, his tone cautious now. "What's the worst that could happen?" Tom said, his voice thick with nervous excitement, the kind of excitement that only came from alcohol and the thrill of doing something dangerous. Amber hesitated, but something in her gut told her to turn back. But her curiosity, and the rest of the group, kept her feet moving forward. They had come this far. Pushing the door open, a gust of cold air hit them, so sharp that it left their skin prickling. A musty, oppressive smell wafted from within, the scent of old wood and something decayed. It filled their lungs as they stepped inside, making it hard to breathe. The house was dark, save for the flickering light. It cast long, erratic shadows across the dust-choked floor, the walls seemingly pulsating with an eerie energy. The air was freezing here, far colder than it should have been, especially for a summer night in the south. A chill ran through Amber, goosebumps rising along her arms. She exchanged a glance with Sarah, who looked equally unnerved. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. At first, Amber didn't, but then, just beneath the sound of their breathing, beneath the low hum of their footsteps, there was something else. Faint, almost like a whisper, too soft to make out. The house wasn't empty. Joe stepped forward. "Let's check the rooms," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. They followed him into the house's first room, a parlor that had once been grand but was now swallowed by decay. Cobwebs hung in the corners, the furniture overturned, all of it coated in a thick layer of dust. The walls seemed to be breathing in the dim light, a strange, pulsating sensation in the air that made the hairs on the back of Amber's neck stand on end. Tom crossed the room, his eyes fixed on the wall where the light seemed to grow brighter. "I don't like this," he muttered. "This isn't just a light." Amber stepped toward him. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes were glued to something, a crack in the wall. And that's when they all noticed it. The shadows, moving, shifting in the corners, stretching and warping, as if something unseen was making them move. "Something's not right," Sarah whispered. "Let's leave, now." But before anyone could turn, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the walls, making their hearts race.
They spun around, only to find themselves trapped in the house. No windows, no doors to escape through. "Did you lock it?" Tom asked, his voice rising. Amber shook her head. "I didn't do anything." They ran to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air thickening, colder. The whispers grew louder, not coming from anywhere specific, but from everywhere. Frantic, they searched the house for another way out. But the house was playing tricks. Rooms they thought they had already checked were now different, rearranged, as if it was shifting to keep them trapped. The flickering light became blinding, and the shadows grew more aggressive, darting towards them, reaching out. Then, in the back room, they found it. A faint outline of something glowing, something not from this world. It wasn't a bulb, not a candle, but a thick, pulsing glow emanating from a small, carved box resting on an old, rotting table. Amber reached toward it, but before her fingers could touch the box, the floor creaked beneath them, and the whispers, now clearly voices, screamed in unison. "We don't want you to leave," they hissed. Suddenly, Amber understood. The house wasn't haunted by spirits. It was a living thing, feeding off their fear, drawing them in, keeping them trapped. The door opened again. No words were spoken. No one moved. The house had made its point. They fled, stumbling back into the night, the oppressive weight of the house lifting as they ran, gasping for air. But behind them the light flickered out, and the last thing Amber heard as they ran into the dark woods was the sound of the door creaking shut once again. The house was waiting for the next group, and it would always wait. The title of the story: The Forgotten Soul. The mountains of southern America were always veiled in mystery, even in the most mundane of times. Deep in the thick woods, in a village so small it could barely be found on a map, the air was thick with ancient whispers. The villagers spoke often of legends that had been passed down through generations, tales of spirits, of curses, and of forgotten souls that could never find peace. These spirits were said to haunt the land, their restless souls disturbed by disrespect and neglect. The stories were told in hushed tones, over firelight, in warning. No one in the village dared speak of them for too long, for fear that they might attract the spirits' attention. Mai, however, was never one to heed these warnings. She had grown up hearing the tales, the ghost stories that crept through the corners of every room at night, but they had never truly bothered her. She had always been a curious soul,
more intrigued than frightened by the mysteries that clung to the land like the fog in the early mornings. Returning home after a weekend trip with friends, she found herself walking alone down the narrow trail that wound its way through the dense forest. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving behind only a thin sliver of moonlight that barely broke through the canopy of trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint chirp of distant crickets. The eerie quietness settled around her like a cloak, pressing against her skin, making every footstep sound louder than it should. The forest was never completely silent, but tonight something felt different. The usual sounds, rustling leaves, animal calls, the whispering wind, were muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mai's mind drifted back to the warmth of the village, the laughter of her friends, the comfort of her bed. But the deeper she ventured into the forest, the more the feeling of unease tightened around her chest. She quickened her pace, but the path seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees growing denser, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers.
Then, just when the air began to feel too thick to bear, she saw it, half hidden in the underbrush, barely visible in the low light. A stone, weathered by time, moss growing thick around the edges. She stopped, squinting through the darkness, and realized it was a gravestone. Old, ancient. The sight made her heart skip a beat. She had never seen this stone before, not in all her years of walking these woods. Curiosity gnawed at her, and she stepped closer, her breath misting in the cold air. The stone was cracked and worn, the inscription barely legible. Mai crouched beside it, her fingers tracing the rough edges of the grave. A feeling of profound sadness washed over her as she realized this was no ordinary grave. This was a forgotten resting place. She could sense that it had been neglected, untouched for what seemed like centuries. She swallowed, looking around. The night felt oppressive, as though the woods were watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She hesitated, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. Mai reached into her bag and pulled out a small candle, her hands shaking slightly as she lit it. The faint flame flickered, casting long shadows over the grave, and for a brief moment she thought she saw something move in the corner of her vision. But when she turned, the forest remained still. A cold gust of wind swept through the trees, and the candle flickered violently, threatening to go out. Mai leaned forward, holding the candle closer to the gravestone, and whispered a prayer. It was a simple gesture, one of respect for the soul that lay forgotten beneath the earth. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in showing respect.
But
As the words left her lips, the air grew colder, unnaturally so. The shadows around the grave deepened, and the rustling of the trees seemed to grow louder, more agitated. Mai felt a sudden chill crawl up her spine, and she turned around, half expecting someone to be there. But there was no one. Then the figure appeared. At first, it was just a faint outline, a shadow too dark to be part of the night. But as Mai's eyes adjusted, it became clearer. A figure, tall and gaunt, emerged from the trees. Its features were indistinct, but its eyes, dark, hollow eyes, locked onto hers. It was as if the night itself had taken form, a thing born of shadow and cold. The air around it crackled with an oppressive energy, and Mai's breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't speak, but it didn't need to. It pointed toward the grave, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a wave of terror through her. Mai's heart raced in her chest, and the candle she held wavered in her trembling hands. The temperature dropped further, the darkness around her pressing in like a tangible force. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. The forest around her came alive with a noise she couldn't quite describe. Whispers, faint at first, then louder, growing into a cacophony of voices. They rose from the earth, 1,000 disembodied whispers calling her name, calling for vengeance. Mai stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror. But the figure remained unmoving. It pointed again, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The voices were angry, full of resentment. The forgotten souls had awakened.
"You've disturbed us," the whispering voices hissed. The cold wrapped around her, suffocating her, making it impossible to breathe. Mai's legs shook, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. She had heard the stories, tales of spirits who rose when their resting places were disrespected. She had always thought them to be nothing more than that, stories. But now, standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by the spirits of the forgotten, she realized how wrong she had been. She turned to run, but the shadows twisted around her, as if the forest itself was alive and closing in on her. Her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard to the ground. The whispers grew louder, now shrieking in agony. She covered her ears, but it was no use. Everywhere she turned, the spirits reached for her, pulling her deeper into the forest. But then, just as quickly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The whispers faded. The figure retreated into the shadows. The forest went silent again. Mai lay on the ground, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. When she finally found the strength to stand, she looked around. The grave was gone. The tombstone had disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. There was no sign of the spirit, no trace of the restless souls. The forest was once again still, as though nothing had happened. But Mai knew better. As she walked back toward the village,
her heart still racing. She could feel the weight of the spirit's presence lingering behind her. The forgotten souls had seen her, and now they would never let her forget.
The tires of Jack's old sedan hummed against the empty road, the headlights barely illuminating the path ahead. It had been a long, exhausting drive, and with the clock pushing well past midnight, Jack figured a quick detour would be a harmless way to stretch his legs. His phone had no signal, and the dim road signs indicated there was a small, abandoned town not far off, a place called Greendale. Curiosity gnawed at him. An old ghost town, likely deserted for decades, with crumbling buildings that seemed to collapse on themselves as they aged. It seemed like the perfect place for an adventure, even if it was just a quick glimpse of history before he headed back to the highway. The town's entrance loomed in front of him, a large archway barely holding together. As Jack drove in, the unsettling silence of the place gripped him. There was no wind, no distant sound of animals stirring, only the oppressive quiet, like a blanket suffocating everything around it. The streetlights flickered, casting pale pools of light on the cracked sidewalks. The houses were in various stages of decay, with broken windows and overgrown gardens choking the life out of the streets. Jack parked his car near the center of town, his engine dying with a soft sputter, as though even the car didn't want to be there. He took a deep breath, the air thick with something he couldn't quite place: dust, decay, and something colder, more sinister. The urge to explore clawed at him. He stepped out of his car, and the sound of his boots crunching on gravel felt unnaturally loud in the stillness. He made his way toward the largest building he could see, the remains of an old Victorian house. Its peeling paint and sagging porch seemed to beckon him, and without thinking, he stepped inside.
The door groaned loudly, its hinges protesting the intrusion, but Jack pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust, the remnants of old furniture scattered across the rooms like forgotten memories. As he wandered deeper into the house, the creaking floorboards seemed to follow him, each step amplifying the sound. It was as if the house was alive, watching him. In the corner of his eye, something flickered, an image of a figure, pale and thin, standing just at the edge of his vision. He turned quickly, but the room was empty. A gust of air swept through the house, making the old door at the far end of the hallway swing open with a slow squeal. A cold shiver ran down his spine, but Jack pressed on, his curiosity outweighing the growing discomfort. The whispers began then, soft at first, barely perceptible, but as Jack ventured further into the heart of the house, they grew louder. At first he thought it was the wind or the creak of old pipes, but the voices had an unmistakable quality, human, full of pain and yearning. "Help, please." The words seemed to curl around him like smoke, getting into his mind. Jack froze, trying to make sense of it, but the voices grew louder, each one seeming to come from a different direction. He spun around, but there was nothing, no one. Just the faint traces of figures, barely visible, flickering like shadows in the corner of his vision. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he continued to move through the house, the whispers growing more desperate, more urgent. Then, as if on cue, the floor beneath him creaked loudly, and he stumbled forward, barely catching himself on the doorframe. From the corner of the room, a figure materialized, its form flickering like static on an old television. It was a woman, her face gaunt, eyes hollow. Her lips parted, but the voice that came out was not her own.
They never leave. None of us ever leave. The voice echoed, distorted, like 100 voices speaking at once. Jack's heart raced. He backed away, only to hear another creak behind him. He spun, and this time the figure was closer. A man, his body twisted in an unnatural way. His skin was translucent, almost ghostly. Panic surged through Jack's chest. He turned, running through the house, his footsteps a frantic rhythm against the creaking floorboards. The whispers followed him, chasing him. He burst out into the open air, the cool night hitting his face like a slap. But as he ran toward his car, something stopped him. The town had changed. The roads were now lined with shadows, the buildings standing at odd angles, more decayed than before. It was as if the town itself had shifted, becoming a labyrinth of forgotten memories, trapping him inside. The door of his car was locked. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking violently. But no matter how hard he tried, the keys refused to turn. A voice whispered from behind him again, this time clearer, more insistent. "You're one of us now." Jack turned, his breath caught in his throat. The figures from the house surrounded him, their faces contorted in agony, their bodies flickering between life and death. They reached out for him, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and in a flash of light Jack found himself standing once again at the center of the town, just as he had arrived. But everything was different now. The town was no longer decayed. It was alive, full of people who stared at him with hollow eyes. He was no longer an outsider. The town had claimed him. And as the door of his car creaked open by itself, Jack understood, once you enter, you never truly leave.